Beneath the thunder of bombs and parades of propaganda, shadows moved, silent, unsung, and unmerciful. What if the deadliest weapon of the war wasn't dropped from a plane or launched from a silo, but built with stolen hands deep underground? This isn't the story found in textbooks. It's the one smuggled out in blood-stained photographs and buried files, the kind of story that was never meant to be told. Until now. The rain was gentle that morning in Buckinghamshire. Dew clung to the windowpanes of the old Victorian mansion that had been turned into the nerve center of Britain's top-secret code-breaking operation. It was October 1941, and Eleanor Shaw, aged 24, arrived at Bletchley Park with a suitcase full of books and a letter of summons stamped with the seal of His Majesty's government. She'd been plucked from the University of Cambridge, where her unassuming brilliance in mathematics had caught the eye of a quiet man from the government code and cipher school. The world around her was at war, and Eleanor quickly realized that the battle wasn't only being fought on beaches and battlefields. It lived inside intercepted German transmissions, tangled in layers of encrypted gibberish churned out daily by the feared Enigma machine. She was assigned to Hut 6, where day and night the whir of typewriters and murmured calculations filled the air like a second pulse. At first, Eleanor's presence drew curious stares. Women were a growing presence at Bletchley, but few worked side by side with senior cryptanalysts. She kept her head down, letting her work speak for itself. Within weeks, she was analyzing patterns in Luftwaffe communications, learning how certain officers repeated phrases or reused settings. Each slip, each habit, was a crack in the Enigma's armor. By late November, Eleanor had noticed a strange consistency in messages intercepted from a U-boat group operating in the North Atlantic. The codes, once impenetrable, now revealed small but recurring anomalies, indicators that the Kriegsmarine had perhaps grown complacent. She cross-referenced transmission timings and locations with convoy routes. What she found made her blood run cold. A massive U-boat ambush was being orchestrated under the surface, targeting convoy HX-192, a fleet of 50 Allied ships laden with vital supplies, scheduled to depart Halifax within days. The signals suggested an unprecedented gathering of submarines. Eleanor raced to share her findings with Commander Travis, head of naval intelligence at Bletchley. He reviewed her analysis in silence, then ordered her to keep working, double-check every calculation. Within 24 hours, confirmation arrived via a separate decrypt from the Norwegian resistance. Dozens of German subs had left their ports, bound west. Eleanor's work had uncovered a wolf-pack ambush that could have crippled Britain's lifeline across the Atlantic. The Royal Navy adjusted the convoy route in secret. On December 3rd, when the submarines surfaced in the North Atlantic, expecting prey, they found only empty waves. Furious and bewildered, Admiral Donitz raged from his headquarters in Paris. Eleanor received no praise. Her name was never recorded in any official dispatch. Instead, she returned to her desk and resumed her endless dance with the Enigma. Weeks blurred into months. The cryptographers of Bletchley Park were told little of what happened beyond the perimeter fence. Eleanor began to feel the weight of isolation. Each breakthrough came at a price: sleepless nights, frayed nerves, and growing tension among the codebreakers. Coffee and cigarettes fueled them, but the strain crept into their bones. A colleague in Hut 8, Alan Turing, became increasingly withdrawn, haunted by his own relentless pursuit of the daily settings for Enigma. Then, in April 1942, another message caught Eleanor's attention. It hinted at a new cipher layer, an upgrade to the Enigma system used by the WWII, German military intelligence. The new encryption, nicknamed Shark, was fiendishly complex. Bletchley struggled to keep pace. Allied ships began to sink again in horrifying numbers. Eleanor volunteered to join a temporary task force aimed at breaking the new system. Together with a team of Polish mathematicians and a British naval officer with a photographic memory, they spent 14-hour days analyzing permutations. Eleanor devised a technique using crib guesses, educated assumptions of German phrases likely to appear in messages, to force patterns into the machine. It was mind-numbing, tedious work, but in June, they cracked the Shark cipher long enough to intercept a message describing a secret conference of German naval officers aboard a cruiser near Norway. The message allowed the British to mount a surprise airstrike, sinking the cruiser and killing 2 senior U-boat commanders. The tide turned again. Quiet celebrations echoed through the huts, muted by the knowledge that war never truly paused. On one grim afternoon in October 1942, Eleanor received word that her older brother, a Royal Air Force navigator, had been shot down over France. He was listed as missing, presumed dead. She took a single day off before returning to her post, pouring grief into her calculations, chasing signals through the static. The war dragged on. As Allied forces pushed through Italy and prepared for an eventual return to France, the importance of Bletchley Park's work only grew. By the summer of 1944, Eleanor was instrumental in confirming the location of panzer divisions stationed inland from Normandy, information crucial to the planning of Operation Overlord. Her decrypts were passed to General Eisenhower himself, though her name was redacted. When D-Day arrived, Eleanor listened on the radio as soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy. She recognized place names, coastal defenses she had read about only in German communiques. As chaos unfolded across Europe, she remained behind her desk, her war fought in silence and secrecy. After the German surrender, the workers of Bletchley were sworn to silence. Eleanor packed her belongings and left as quietly as she had arrived. She returned to academia, taught mathematics at a small college in Wales, and never spoke of her role in the war. Her name appeared in no history books. Her family never knew what she had done. Decades later, after classified files were declassified and the veil over Bletchley Park was lifted, Eleanor's contributions were finally uncovered in faded memos and marginal notes. Pages signed only with her initials, E.S., a posthumous commendation followed. A plaque bearing her name was added to the museum at Bletchley Park, beneath a quote she once scribbled on a notepad during a sleepless night. "War is not always won with guns. Sometimes it's won with silence, numbers, and a stubborn refusal to give up." Eleanor Shaw never sought glory. But in the quiet corridors of history, her story lives on, encrypted in the memory of a war won by minds as much as might. The dense canopy of the Solomon Islands swallowed light like a mouthful of secrets. The air was hot, thick with humidity, buzzing with insects and death. On August 7, 1942, Corporal Jack Harding leapt from a Higgins boat into the surf of Guadalcanal, his M1 rifle held high, heart pounding in his chest. It was the United States' first major offensive against the Japanese Empire, and for Harding, a former steelworker from Pittsburgh, it felt like jumping straight into the jaws of hell. They called it Operation Watchtower, but the Marines on the beach soon called it something else: the meat grinder. Harding's unit, 1st Marine Division, was tasked with seizing the unfinished Japanese airstrip later named Henderson Field. The landing itself had gone smoother than expected, but the jungle, the disease, the starvation, and the relentless counterattacks would soon grind that early optimism into the dirt. Harding was no stranger to hard labor, but jungle warfare was another beast entirely. It wasn't just the enemy, it was the leeches, the fever, the rot that crept into your boots, your stomach, your soul. Within days, dysentery swept the camp. The rain never stopped. Malaria laid low even the toughest men. And then the Japanese came. At night, the jungle echoed with guttural cries, "Banzai!" as waves of Japanese soldiers charged in suicidal assaults. Harding remembered his first firefight in bursts. The deafening crack of rifles, the screech of mortar shells, the sudden, chilling silence after the final scream. The faces of the fallen blurred together. He remembered one boy, Private Ellis, shot through the neck. Died trying to reload. Harding never forgot the blood spraying against his helmet. Food became scarce. Supplies were choked off by Japanese naval forces that dominated the sea at night. The men chewed on hardtack, sometimes roasted rat. Sleep came in fragments. Harding wrote letters to his wife back home, never mentioning the horror. "Weather's warm," he'd write. "The boys are keeping spirits high." But Guadalcanal broke spirits. In late September, the Japanese launched a massive attack aimed at recapturing Henderson Field. They struck at night, using the darkness to mask their movements. Harding's squad dug in along a muddy ridge known as Bloody Hill. For 48 straight hours, They fought off wave after wave of screaming infantry. Hand-to-hand combat in the rain, bayonets slick with blood. Harding was stabbed in the thigh but kept firing, his rifle barrel glowing red. By morning, hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay dead, their bodies strewn like broken branches across the ridge. The Marines lost dozens. Harding's sergeant, a wiry Texan named Duke Wallace, died holding a grenade in each hand, smiling as he was overrun. They buried him with no ceremony, marking the grave with his helmet and dog tags tied to a stick. The battle for Guadalcanal wasn't won with a single victory. It was a war of inches, of supply lines, of airstrips contested by mud and blood. Harding watched friends disappear in the underbrush, never to return. He watched a buddy get torn apart by a Japanese mortar while trying to shave. He learned to sleep with his boots on, to kill without hesitation, to cry silently under the roar of Hellcats and dauntless dive bombers. He remembered the first time he saw a Japanese pilot go down in flames, his Zero clipped by an F-4F Wildcat, spiraling into the jungle in a fireball. Harding didn't cheer. He just kept cleaning his rifle. In December, the tide began to shift. The Navy returned in strength. More supplies, fresh troops, even mail from home. Harding received a photograph of his newborn daughter, Emily, born 3 weeks before he left for the Pacific. He stared at the image for hours in the flickering light of a foxhole, tears cutting through the grime on his cheeks. It gave him something to live for. As the Japanese withdrew in early 1943, the surviving Marines were gaunt, filthy, and haunted. Harding's division had lost over 1,000 men. He limped onto the transport ship that would take him back to base, thinner by 30 pounds, carrying scars both visible and buried deep. When he reached Australia for rest and recovery, Harding was offered a medal for bravery. He accepted it quietly, then asked to be sent back to the front. "I've got friends still out there," he told the chaplain. But even in the months that followed, through Tarawa, Saipan, and beyond, Guadalcanal never left him. It remained etched into his nightmares, into the tremble of his hands when a car backfired, into the silence he kept about what he'd seen. Years later, his daughter would ask him why he flinched at thunder. He simply said, "Sometimes storms sound like war." Harding lived to see the war end. He came home with shrapnel still lodged near his spine, a limp he carried with no complaint, and eyes that sometimes stared too long at nothing. He worked in a post office for 32 years, raised a family, grew tomatoes in his backyard. He rarely spoke of the war. But every August, he sat alone on the porch, opened a tin box filled with old photos and letters, and remembered. In his final letter home from Guadalcanal, written after the battle for Bloody Hill, he wrote, "They don't write songs about places like this. No medals make it worth it. But we held the line. That's something, isn't it? We held." Decades later, a historian researching the Pacific Campaign would find Harding's letters archived in a forgotten trunk at a veterans center. The words painted a portrait of a Marine who didn't think of himself as a hero, just a man who endured. And perhaps that was the point. Guadalcanal wasn't about glory. It was about survival. And men like Jack Harding made sure that the world would never forget the price. Marie Dupont was a schoolteacher in Paris when the war began, a quiet woman of 30 with a love of literature and a keen eye for the unsaid. When the Germans marched into the city in June 1940, Marie stood at her classroom window and watched them arrive. The sound of marching boots on cobblestones echoed like thunder through the marais. By the end of the week, her school was closed, her freedom dissolved, and her city was draped in swastikas. But Marie did not break. She adapted. Her resistance began simply, hiding banned books, whispering news from the BBC to trusted neighbors, and slipping pamphlets beneath cafe tables. Her transformation into a spy began one cold November evening when a man named Émile Roche approached her outside the Palais Garnier. He was tall, wore an impeccable overcoat, and had the eyes of a man used to vanishing without a trace. "You're braver than you appear, mademoiselle," he said softly. "France needs people who can see without being seen." Émile recruited her into a growing underground web of saboteurs, couriers, and informants coordinated with the British Special Operations Executive. Her code name was Newt, Night. She was trained in basic encryption, dead drops, signal codes, and sabotage. Her classroom became a front. Behind maps of the Loire Valley, she charted troop movements. In book spines, she hid microfilm. She taught by day and planned railway derailments by candlelight. The network she joined, known only as Le Fil Noir, extended through the veins of occupied France. Resistance members posed as farmers, nuns, taxi drivers. They smuggled messages inside baguettes and explosives inside wine barrels. Every act of defiance carried a price, and betrayal lurked behind every face. In the spring of 1943, Marie was tasked with her most dangerous assignment yet: to infiltrate a German administrative office in Montmartre suspected of coordinating anti-partisan operations. Under the alias Madame Fournier, she posed as a typist and gathered intelligence on troop deployments, arrest lists, and railway schedules. She would spend her lunch breaks memorizing documents, then transmit the details at night via coded messages to London using a wireless radio hidden in a church crypt. Her handler, a wiry ex-lawyer named Henri, warned her often, "The Gestapo doesn't just kill. They erase. Be cautious, Marie." Caution, however, was no shield against chance. One evening in June, a fellow courier named Luke was captured in Lyon with a list of names. Marie's alias was among them. She received a whispered warning in the marketplace: "Run." She disappeared into the countryside, hiding among sympathetic farmers near Orleans. For weeks she moved under cover of darkness, narrowly avoiding checkpoints and patrols. But Marie refused to leave France. With new forged papers and dyed hair, she returned to Paris under a new identity. Her work resumed. The Gestapo posted her face in underground stations, branding her a terrorist. That only strengthened her resolve. By early 1944, Le Fil Noir had grown bolder. They began arming local militias in the countryside, sabotaging trains that carried German armor toward Normandy, and assassinating collaborators in plain sight. Marie coordinated several missions targeting key infrastructure: telephone exchanges, power substations, fuel depots. The Germans responded with brutal reprisals. Entire villages were burned. Resistance members were tortured, hanged in public squares as warnings. One of Marie's closest allies, a priest named Father Claude, was executed for sheltering Allied airmen. His last message to her, scrawled on a torn hymn page, read, "The fire you carry will outlast them. Let it burn." In July 1944, as whispers of an Allied invasion grew louder, Marie was chosen to deliver critical intelligence to London: the exact location of German artillery batteries near the beaches of Normandy. The information had been acquired through a German clerk blackmailed into cooperation. With it, Allied bombers could soften defenses before the landings. Failure meant disaster. The transmission was to be made from a rooftop in Belleville during a brief window of scheduled radio silence. As Marie climbed the building's rusted fire escape with her wireless set in a basket, she could see the Eiffel Tower glowing faintly through the haze. She tapped the keys with trembling fingers, praying the signal would carry. Moments after the final dot and dash, headlights flared below. A black Opel staff car. Shouts. Gunfire. She ran, weaving across rooftops as bullets snapped past her ears. A neighbor opened a skylight, yanked her inside, and hid her beneath floorboards as Gestapo agents stormed the building. She remained there for 3 days, bruised and feverish, listening to jackboots above. The message had reached London. The batteries were bombed. The beaches opened. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. American tanks rolled down the Champs-Élysées. Marie, pale and thin, stood among the crowd outside the Hôtel de Ville. She had returned to her classroom by then, her old life waiting in fragments. Students filed back into their seats, notebooks opened, and Marie resumed teaching. But her eyes carried the shadows of rooftops and radio static. After the war, she was quietly decorated by the French Provisional Government and the British SOE. She refused public recognition, claiming the dead deserved it more. Émile had been executed in 1944. Henri vanished in the Ardennes. Only a handful of Le Fil Noir survived. In later years, a British historian interviewed Marie for a documentary on European resistance fighters. She declined to appear on film, but offered one thought off the record. They had tanks. We had pencils. They had rifles. We had ink and mirrors and bicycles. And still, we stole from them time, power, control. We taught the world that silence can be a weapon, and shadows can win wars. Her story, long hidden, surfaced decades later in declassified SOE files and a faded photograph found in a school attic. A young woman at a desk, chalk in hand, eyes fierce and unbroken. The war had passed, but the veil of shadows lingered, stitched into the memory of a woman who fought without a uniform and helped bring an empire to its knees. In the fall of 1941, Leningrad stood on the edge of ruin. Nazi Germany, allied with Finland, had encircled the city, cutting off nearly 3 million civilians from the outside world. The German plan was simple: starve the city into submission. What they hadn't planned on was the stubborn endurance of its people. Among them was a boy named Alexei Morozov, just 12 years old when the siege began. Alexei lived in a communal apartment with his mother, grandfather, and younger sister, Katya. His father, a factory machinist, had joined the Red Army in July and never returned. The last postcard came in August, with 2 words: "Stand strong." By September, the bombing started. The first explosion Alexei ever heard shook the windows and collapsed the bakery 2 blocks away. The smell of burned bread lingered in the air for days. Food became the city's obsession. Every adult queued for hours in snowstorms to receive rations: a crust of bread, a spoon of sawdust-laced flour, sometimes nothing. The winter of 1941 was the coldest in memory. Pipes froze. Rats vanished. Dogs were eaten. Alexei's mother boiled wallpaper for the glue in it, desperate soup with no taste. On good days, they shared a single slice of black bread, each child allowed 1 bite. Alexei learned to chew slowly, as if time itself could become nourishment. His mother kept a diary through it all. January 12th. Katya is coughing. Alexei carried her 3 kilometers to the clinic. No medicine. No heat. The doctor is dead. We came home in silence. Every morning, Alexei walked the bombed streets to collect firewood, broken furniture, debris, even splinters. Once, he found a frozen corpse near the old opera house, wrapped in a red army coat. He didn't cry. Death was common, almost ordinary. He simply took the man's boots. His own had no soles. In the evenings, the family huddled together under a blanket, listening to the radio when it worked. Soviet broadcasts played Tchaikovsky over static, mingled with news of battles in the West and calls to resist. Alexei would press close to the speaker, imagining his father somewhere far off, hearing the same music. At school, what was left of it, the children read poetry and learned about sacrifice. Alexei's favorite book was Pushkin's Ruslan and Ludmila, its pages soft from so many hands. Their teacher, Ms. Kozlova, taught even as her skin turned blue from cold. One day, she collapsed at her desk and never got up. Alexei buried her himself, using a metal scoop in the courtyard while the snow fell in silence. As spring approached, the city was still under siege, but hope flickered. A secret supply route, the Road of Life, had opened across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga. Trucks skated across the ice, dodging Luftwaffe bombers and artillery shells. Alexei watched them from a rooftop once, eyes wide as headlights blinked in the white gloom. When one truck exploded, the boom rattled through his chest. Still, the convoy came. That summer, Alexei joined a group of teenagers recruited by the city authorities to help unload supply trucks and dig defensive trenches. He was given a red armband, a tin of kerosene, and half a loaf of bread, payment for his labor. His fingers bled from frozen tools. But he smiled. "I'm helping Leningrad stand," he told his mother. In December 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Iskra to break the German stranglehold. Artillery roared from the south. The sky lit up with orange and red. Alexei crouched in a cellar with his family, holding Katya's hand as dust rained from the ceiling. On January 18, 1943, the blockade was partially lifted. A narrow corridor to the outside world opened. Alexei saw the first train arrive with supplies and soldiers. Crowds wept openly. Strangers embraced. Church bells rang for the first time in months. But the siege didn't truly end until January 1944. By then, over 1 million people had died in Leningrad, most from starvation, cold, or disease. Alexei's grandfather was among them, passing quietly in his sleep the night before the city was freed. Alexei helped carry his body to the mass grave outside Smolensk Cemetery, where row upon row of markers stood in the frozen soil. When the Red Army paraded through Nevsky Prospect in victory, Alexei stood on the curb, thinner than a shadow, one arm around Katya. His mother held the diary in her coat pocket, pages full of sorrow, strength, and unspoken victories. After the war, Alexei grew up to be a writer. His first book, Iron Winter, told the story of the siege through the eyes of a child who survived it. It was banned for several years under Stalin, deemed too personal. But it spread underground, passed from hand to hand, treasured like contraband truth. In his later years, Alexei visited schools and libraries, always carrying one object in his satchel, the piece of wallpaper his mother once boiled into soup. He'd hold it up for the children and say, "This was dinner. And yet, we lived." Leningrad endured because its people refused to die quietly. Their resistance was not in bullets, but in breath. Not in flags, but in footsteps trudging through snow for bread. And in the quiet heroism of a boy who carried hope on frozen streets, never knowing whether the sun would rise again. In the spring of 1944, rumors rippled through Allied intelligence circles about a new kind of German weapon, silent, swift, and capable of crossing the English Channel without warning. It was called the Vergeltungswaffe, or V-2 rocket. Unlike the V-1 buzz bomb, this one fell without sound, and by the time it hit, it had already killed. The British code-named it Goliath. While the public feared flying bombs, few knew the V-2 was being assembled in the harrowing underground tunnels of the Mittelwerk facility in central Germany, built by the hands of forced laborers from the nearby Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. Allied planners feared thousands of casualties if the V-2 program succeeded in full. Something had to be done. Thus, Operation Goliath was born. It was one of the most secret missions ever planned by the Special Operations Executive, SOE. The goal: infiltrate the Mittelwerk plant and sabotage the production line without triggering suspicion. A direct bombing raid was too risky. German scientists and engineers might simply relocate. The job needed to be done surgically, from the inside. Major Thomas Reed, a quiet, wiry man with a Cambridge education and a knack for sabotage, was chosen to lead the mission. Fluent in German and a veteran of operations in Belgium and Norway, Reed had once escaped a Gestapo prison camp by faking death. He was joined by a team of 4, Captain Luc Moreau of the French Resistance, SOE agent Maria Kowalska, a Polish demolitions expert, Sergeant James Holloway, a cocky American radioman with the OSS, and a former German engineer named Dr. Hans Keller, who had defected after losing his wife to a Nazi racial cleansing policy. Their entry into Germany was as bold as it was bizarre. Disguised as a transport convoy of SS engineers, complete with forged papers and stolen uniforms, the team traveled through occupied France and into Thuringia in a commandeered Opel Blitz truck. Every mile brought danger. At each checkpoint, Reed's perfect German and Keller's insider knowledge got them through. The Mittelwerk facility itself was a nightmare carved into stone, a massive warren of tunnels beneath the Kohnstein mountain, lit dimly by floodlights and reeking of oil and despair. Thousands of prisoners, half-starved and beaten, slaved under the eyes of SS guards. The team's plan was twofold: destroy the guidance systems of the next V-2 launch and expose the camp to the world by smuggling out photographic evidence of the conditions inside. Posing as senior engineers from Piemont, they gained access to the assembly line. Reed and Kowalska scoped out the explosive opportunities: fuel valves, gyroscopes, and pressure chambers that could be subtly rigged to fail in flight. Meanwhile, Keller approached the prisoners at night, slipping them extra bread and whispering hope. One prisoner, a Czech physicist named Jan Novak, had memorized every step of the rocket's final stage calibration. He became their key informant. For 2 weeks, they worked in silence, under the noses of the SS. Holloway set up a covert radio inside a discarded ventilation shaft, sending coded updates to London. Eagle nest in position. Target egg warming. Hatching soon. On the 15th night, the first Sabotage went live. A test rocket launched from a secret pad near Nordhausen flew only 17 kilometers before veering wildly and exploding midair. The Germans suspected technical failure. Reed grinned in the dark. But they couldn't push too hard, or the team would be discovered. They needed one final act to ensure the program was crippled long enough for Allied forces to reach the facility. The opportunity came on April 12th. A delegation of high-ranking Nazi officials, including Albert Speer himself, was scheduled to tour Mittelwerk. Reed's team planned to destroy the plant's fuel storage chambers during the inspection, blaming it on an accident, all while extracting Novak and the photographic evidence. That morning, with tension thick as fog, Kowalska and Moreau planted shaped charges behind the storage tanks under the guise of maintenance. Holloway jammed nearby communications. Reed positioned himself near the main assembly floor, a pistol hidden beneath his engineer's coat. The timing had to be perfect. At 10:07 a.m., as Speer walked past the inspection platform, an explosion ripped through the western tunnel. Flames erupted, and screams filled the cavern. Moreau triggered the second charge near the gyroscope lab, collapsing a support column. Reed grabbed Novak, and under cover of the chaos, they sprinted toward the exit shaft. But not all made it. Moreau was shot trying to cover their retreat, holding off guards with a stolen MP-40 as the others disappeared into a side tunnel. He died buying them precious seconds. Kowalska, bleeding from shrapnel, detonated a final charge behind her to seal the pursuing SS troopers inside. By nightfall, Reed, Holloway, Keller, and Novak had reached a safe house arranged by the local resistance. Within a week, they crossed into Allied lines. The photographic evidence smuggled out of Mittelwerk horrified British and American commanders. Emaciated workers, brutal beatings, mass graves. Eisenhower personally ordered copies distributed to Washington and London. The images became part of the archive used at the Nuremberg trials to indict key Nazi figures for war crimes. More critically, the Sabotage delayed the V-2 program by over a month, long enough for Allied air superiority and ground forces to overrun key infrastructure sites. While the rockets still launched, fewer reached their targets, and many malfunctioned. Operation Goliath's precision prevented thousands of deaths in London and Antwerp. After the war, Thomas Reed disappeared into quiet anonymity, declining medals or fanfare. Maria Kowalska returned to Poland and became a teacher. Holloway later wrote a book titled Rockets and Shadows, revealing parts of the mission under heavy censorship. Dr. Hans Keller helped rebuild post-war Germany, haunted but determined. As for Jan Novak, the boy-genius physicist who spent 2 years enslaved under a mountain, he became one of the first post-war scientists to work in the newly formed European Space Agency. His contribution to peaceful rocketry would forever stand in silent defiance of the horrors once built in the darkness beneath the Konstein. Operation Goliath remained classified until 1983, when it was finally declassified and released in fragments. Even today, the full story is not widely known. But in the annals of World War II's most daring missions, it stands as one of the quietest victories, achieved not with armies, but with shadows, courage, and a plan scribbled in invisible ink. The rockets stopped flying, but the silence that followed screamed louder than any explosion. What they found beneath the Konstein wasn't just a factory, it was a tomb of progress built on suffering. And those who dared to enter left with scars no victory parade could hide. Some truths don't die with the war. They wait, buried in the dark, until someone dares to open the box.